Hi everybody, I'm here today to talk to you about vampire panic. So vampire panic happened in New England in the 1800s, and it was basically a pretty extreme reaction to a tuberculosis outbreak. Tuberculosis at the time was known as consumption because it appeared to consume the infected person's body. Now, the cause of tuberculosis was not discovered until the late 1800s when they determined that it was a bacterial disease. However, all of these little towns and villages didn't know this for quite some time after that. So, before that, they had no idea what this was, how to prevent it, how to stop it, how to help those that were sick with it. So, because of this massive lack of understanding, people began to think that possibly somebody that had died from the disease was coming back and feeding off the life force or the bodies of those that were living that ended up suffering from the disease. So, in an attempt to protect the survivors and stop the effects of consumption, the bodies of those that had died from the disease were exhumed and examined. Now, the deceased was determined to be a vampire, to be coming back and feeding on their loved ones or people in the area where they lived if they were not decomposed enough, which you can imagine was not good for people in the wintertime when bodies decompose more slowly. Other ways that they determined if somebody was a vampire would be if the body was bloated, if there was blood around the mouth or nose, and they also would remove the heart and check for fresh blood in the heart. So if somebody was deemed to be a vampire, steps were taken to stop them. Now, this would include things like putting sharp objects in their coffin, turning their corpse upside down, and in some cases, they would decapitate the body. They would remove the thigh bones and put the thigh bones elsewhere so that the body couldn't walk around. They would break the rib cage. They would put a stake through the heart or through the mouth or through the head. They would remove the organs and burn them and consume the ashes. So they did a lot of kind of things that we now would view as crazy, but in that time they were just trying to protect their loved ones, which is, what we all want to do, right? So I'm going to talk about two of the vampire panic victims because I think they have some kind of cool stories. We're going to start with JB, whose story starts again in 1990 when some kids were playing and they discovered a grave. Now, the police were called, and initially investigators thought that this was a grave site from a serial killer that had been active in the area around the same time. But once they investigated, they found out that the corpse that was found was actually more than a century old. So they called in archaeologists. Now, archaeologists dug up the area and found that this was actually a family cemetery at one point. So there was multiple graves here. Now, all of the graves had initials on them. So that's how we know that JB's initials were JB. And we actually also know that he was 55 years old because his coffin said JB 55. So JB's grave site was different from the others. Everybody else was buried normally. JB's grave had been dug up, his coffin had been smashed in, and his corpse bones had been moved around. Now they found his skull and his thigh bones on his rib cage in a skull and crossbones. And initially they had no idea why this happened. Now, when they investigated further, they found out that he had a lot more injuries to his body, like his rib cage was broken, and they figured that out that this had actually happened about 5 years after his death. So somebody dug him up 5 years after he died and did this stuff to his body, which is crazy. So they were not able to identify at that time who JB was. They figured out that likely he was thought to be a vampire, but they could not identify the body because they just didn't have the means at that time. So 30 years later, we finally found out who JB was. So through some really incredible detective work, they used chromosomal DNA profiling, and they were able to link the bones from this grave to somebody called John Barber. Now, once they found the name John Barber, they researched it. They found an obituary for a young man called Nicholas Barber, who was 12 years old, who died in the same area. Now, they then went back to the grave site information and found that there was a coffin in the same area with NB13 on the top of it. So they connected the dots here and discovered that this young man had died, was JB's son. So this person that was buried there was John Barber. Now, they also could tell that this person had quite severe arthritis, and because of that, they said that he was likely a farmer. So JB, the mysterious vampire, was a father and a family man and a farmer, and almost definitely not a vampire. So it's kind of sad that his life kind of went through this this whole horrible end. I don't know, but now we know who he is, and that's kind of a cool story. So I suggest that everybody look up JB because his story is neat. We're going to talk about a cool Bram Stoker connection to Vampire Panic now. So one of the last cases discovered from Vampire Panic was that of Mercy Lena Brown, who was 19 years old when she died. Now, Mercy, who went by Lena, was from Exeter, Rhode Island. So this is where some of the Vampire Panic cases have happened. In December 1882, Lena's mother, Mary Eliza, became sick with tuberculosis, and she died quite quickly. Not long after that, within the year, Lena's sister, Mary Olive, also passed away from tuberculosis. And within a few years of that, her brother Edwin contracted TB as well. So Edwin ended up, at the time they were saying that if you went someplace with better air, you would end up being okay. So he promptly moved to Colorado Springs in the hopes that the fresh air would improve his health. Now, he was there for more than a decade, or right around a decade, and around the time when he came back, Lena became quite ill, and she passed away as well. So Lena had what they called galloping tuberculosis. So essentially they believe that she was infected with the disease for many years with no symptoms. But then when the symptoms appeared, she died quite quickly. So shortly before Lena's death, her brother Edwin, his health took a turn for the worst as well. And he basically decided that he was going to come back to Exeter and be with his family for his last days. Now, before he could get back, Lena passed away. She was buried, and he arrived back home, and he was quite ill. So some of the neighbors came to Lena's father, George, and explained that they were concerned that possibly one of the women that had passed away was coming back and feeding on other people, and that is why Edwin was sick. And they told him that if he exhumed their bodies and determined that one of them was a vampire and they took care of it, then Edwin would get better. So I'm guessing, like, against his better judgment, George agreed to allow them to exhume the bodies of his wife and his two daughters. And on March 17th, 1892, a group of men exhumed the bodies. Now, they did this with the family's doctor and a journalist all looking on. So the journalist was taking notes to write a story about what was going on. So this is where things get pretty interesting. Now, Lena's mother and sister were obviously, after a decade of being dead, they were quite decomposed, almost just bones, and they were determined not to be vampires. Now, Lena had passed away in the winter time, and so she had only been dead for a few months. And because of this, her body wasn't as decomposed as they felt it should be. So they removed her heart and liver and they dissected them, and they discovered both clotted and decomposed blood. This would mean that she was not a vampire, but undeterred, the villagers decided that it had to be her. And because of this, they burned her heart and liver and fed the ashes to her brother Edwin. And they were all convinced that this would cure him. However, Edwin passed away within 2 months of this happening. So unfortunately, their cure did not work. Now, the article that was written by this journalist traveled all the way to London, where it was read by none other than Bram Stoker. Now, it was not long after that Bram Stoker released his book Dracula, which he himself said was based on several knowing and unknowing real people. Now, there is a character in Bram Stoker's book called Lucy, which some people think might be a combination of Lena and Mercy, and might possibly be based on Lena's story. And apparently, Lena's story and Lucy's story are quite similar in the book. So I don't know. I guess it's for everybody to kind of decide for themselves, but you'll have to read the book and read some more about Lena's story and kind of decide for yourself if you think they're connected or not. But that is Lena's story, and I think it's really interesting. And I think the extent that people are willing to go to protect their families is both terrifying and incredible. So yeah, so that is Vampire Panic. And if you have any questions or any other cool information or any stories about other people that were victims of vampire panic, definitely let me know. And otherwise, I will be back on another day with another video about something totally different. Okay, thanks guys. Bye.